Thanks so much, Lisa. I need to talk to you later about whether they have a division in the ocean ski paddling for 5'5" brown guys with Australian accents. That's the only way I'm going to get a medal. But we can talk about that later. Look, thank you all for coming. I think it was Voltaire, and I'm paraphrasing him, of course, and he said, finding validation is a bit like a drunk guy looking for his house. He knows it's out there somewhere, but he can never quite seem to find it. He can never quite seem to get there. I think that can certainly be the case. In the 21st century, as we look around the world, as we look around our community, our city, and when we look inside our own hearts, finding validation can be a tricky thing. And I'm a former lawyer, so I'm going to define the terms early. I completely sync up with what I'm about to say with what Lisa was talking about in terms of the concept of validation itself. Validation, as I'm going to be talking about it, is that affirmation or recognition of our intrinsic value, or recognition of our intrinsic worth. When you validate something, you're recognizing its intrinsic value. And when I talk about gurus, because the topic I want to speak about is which guru got it right, I'm talking in the broadest possible sense. Any one or any ideology or philosophy that has sought to set down a path through which people could find their validation, could find that sense of intrinsic worth affirmed and established. There's a movie called The Martian from a few years ago. Some of you might have seen it, with the chiseled, square-jawed Matt Damon playing the lead role. And he plays the character of an astronaut named Mark Watney, who's part of man's first mission to Mars. And at the beginning of the movie, his team, the NASA team that's there, they need to do an emergency evacuation from Mars because of a tragic accident that's just happened that they think has just killed Mark Watney. And so they do that. And then, of course, he's alive. He's unconscious, but he wakes up and he's stranded on Mars on his own. And the whole movie, and these guys are on the rocket, they're on their way back to Houston. The whole movie is, of course, then about his survival and his quest, not just to survive on Mars, but to make his way back to Earth. And the spoiler, of course, is that he does make it back. I apologise for that. It's still worth seeing the movie. But the final scene of the movie is fascinating. The final scene of the movie is this character, Mark Watney, now a professor in the NASA Academy, many years later, obviously an international celebrity, and he's speaking to these trainees. And he's talking, funnily enough, indirectly and symbolically, but very, very clearly, about validation. And he says to these kids, well, these trainees, he says, you've got to apply yourself and you've got to focus, because when you're out there, you're going to be presented with a problem. You're going to get into some kind of disastrous situation, and you'll be presented with a problem. And if you solve that problem, then you'll get presented with another problem. And if you solve that, you'll get presented with another one. And so it will go. And if you solve enough problems, then you get to come home. If you solve enough problems, then you get to come home. I think it's interesting and I think it's powerful, because when I look at all of the gurus throughout human history and what they have said about validation, about finding that sense of fulfillment and well-being and wholeness in ourselves, it broadly fits in with that paradigm, with that framework of thinking. If you do this, if you solve this, if you follow these rules, if you believe in these things, if you follow these rituals, if you tick these boxes, then you'll get to come home. And of course, the different paradigms and the different gurus call coming home different things. But that's broadly what they're talking about. So I want to spend a few minutes looking at two things. Firstly, to give you guys a very broad overview of what some of the gurus and some of the philosophical and religious systems have said historically about finding validation. And I'm going to be honestly and openly non-exclusive and non-exhaustive. I'm not going to do any of these justice, and I'm going to leave lots out. So I apologise for that, just because of time constraints. But I want to give you guys a flavour of what these gurus have been saying, what's been guiding people, and how they've been looking for validation over the years, globally and historically. And secondly, I want to take an even bigger step back and have a look analytically at how these have been stacking up. What does the evidence actually show? The logical, the philosophical, the experiential evidence. How have these different systems of validation been serving humankind over time? So firstly, what have the gurus said? What have the gurus said? Well, there's lots and lots that could be said about this. But what we see is that often people, whether it's a thought leader, a political leader, a philosopher, a religious leader, they will grab onto an ideal, or they will come up with an ideal, not an idea, an ideal, and onto that ideal they will graft this system of validation. So a great example is freedom. Freedom, as Lisa correctly said, the sovereignty of freedom, if you like, in the Western mind really started with philosophical thinkers, well, way back in ancient Greece, but really took hold with people like John Stuart Mill, who really said that freedom is the way to validation. Freedom is the way to give humanity that sense of worth. Just give them all as much freedom as you possibly can. And that's the ball game. They'll all feel that sense of intrinsic worth, right? Some people think it's pleasure. It goes right back to an ancient Greek guy called Epicurus and some of his followers. And more recently, very recently in modern times, people like Oscar Wilde, a lot of the secular humanists, the hedonistic thinkers, are all about pleasure. They say pleasure is the way to enjoy and embrace and understand that sense of intrinsic worth and validation that you're looking for. And then the political philosophers get involved, people like Thomas Hobbes, Thucydides way back in ancient Greece, these sorts of people. And they say it's about power. Finding validation is about power. There's this human instinct for power. People should just go out there and look for power any way they can. They're going to anyway. It's in our hearts. That's the key to validation. And then the economists have their own theories on both sides of economics. People like Adam Smith who say the way to validation is to build perfectly meritocratic societies through which people can work hard, find out what they're passionate about, work hard, and rise up in the society. And that's where they'll find their validation. And on the flip side, you have people like Karl Marx that say, no, it's not about that. It's about equality, equal societies, giving people perfect justice, what he defines as justice, where everyone gets exactly the same. That's where people will feel validated. They'll feel their sense of intrinsic worth honoured when they see that they're not being unfairly done by as compared with other people. So all of these philosophers, if you like, or thought leaders had all of these systems of thinking of finding validation. We can move then to the great religions, the great religious worldviews. And broadly speaking, and I can't do any of them justice, unfortunately, in any kind of depth, but broadly speaking, they follow a similar paradigm. Do this, behave like this, read this, believe this, and you'll have this sense of validation. And as I said, it's called many different things. It can be called enlightenment or nirvana or moksha or whatever it might be. But it's the same paradigm. It's the same paradigm. That's how you establish or have recognized your intrinsic worth. And then, of course, there's the virtue theorists, the virtue validation team. People like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle were in this. From the East, people like Confucius, where they basically said validation really comes, intrinsic worth of ourselves and of each other can only really be respected and honoured and recognised if we're living ethical lives. And so they built ethical frameworks based on virtues, human virtues. And they said that's the way to validation. So we look at all of these different systems, different theories, different approaches to offering people paths through which they can have their intrinsic value recognised, affirmed, established. So what all of these gurus have effectively done is given us, through external guidance, alleged paths to intrinsic worth. Intrinsic worth that can be found through external guidance. That's the model, that's the paradigm in which some of these gurus, not all of them, but some of them, have been operating in. And I think when we take a step back now to look at how it's actually gone, how can we evaluate these and actually draw some conclusions as to whether any of them got it right, we have to first start by saying that there's a lot of truth in what a lot of them are saying. When we think of things like pleasure and power and justice and meritocracy, these are all things that are legitimate desires of human hearts. We see all of them inside of us. So in terms of the diagnosis of the condition, more often than not, most of the gurus have got something right in the diagnosis. The problem, in my view, comes looking at my own heart, looking at my community, my society, my generation and the generations past and beyond. The problem comes in the prescription, not the diagnosis, in the prescription. And I think there are two problems. The first, I would suggest, applies to some of the gurus, some of the systems of thinking. And the second, I believe, applies to almost all of them. And the first is this. It's the rejection of the transcendent, right? And we see this wonderfully exemplified amongst the kind of spiritual secularists, if you like, the self-help movement, which is another category of gurus in itself. As my boss says, from Oprah to Chopra and everything in between. Right? So the Eat, Pray, Love and the Winning Friends and Influencing People and the 8 Habits and the 7 Habits and the 8th Habit and all of this stuff about personal development. This kind of secularism now trying to be made into spiritual secularism. They're doing okay too, by the way. It's about $11 billion US a year, the self-help sector, if you ever feel like writing a book and not sure of what category to write in. So these guys, along with a whole bunch of other gurus who have tried to cut God out of the picture and still offer people a path to meaning and offer people a path to validation, they are trying to give people intrinsic worth without the transcendent, right? Without a supernatural realm. The problem with intrinsic worth is, by definition, intrinsic value can only be endowed extrinsically. It has to come from outside the system. If you think of a game of Monopoly, the money in a game of Monopoly doesn't have intrinsic value. It has artificial synthetic value because everyone who's playing the game agrees to pretend that the money has worth for the purpose of the game. In order for that synthetic value to be made intrinsic, for that Monopoly money to have intrinsic value, in Australia at least, there would have to be an external authority, a transcendent agent that came in and endowed it with intrinsic value. In Australia, the only person that could do that, the only institution, would be the Federal Reserve Bank, because it is the external organisation that endows currency with intrinsic value. So it is with you and I. If we cut God out of the picture, if we cut the whole spiritual realm out of the picture, and then still try to run around finding intrinsic worth, straight away, the first step we take is that we're looking for, at best, synthetic value. We're looking for worth, respect, regard, validation from people within a closed system. And it'll only be there to the extent that we can get people to agree that it's there, because it's not extrinsically endowed, so it's not intrinsically there. So that's the first problem. So any secular theory, secular system, secular philosophy has this problem. There's no way it can actually offer intrinsic value, except for the value that you can convince other people that you have. The second problem, I think, is a much deeper problem. And Lisa touched on it beautifully when she said, we all mess up. And it's this problem, and it's almost every worldview that does this, both religious and non-religious, both spiritual and secular. It's that it leaves the attainment of validation up to the person in some way, shape or form. The primary responsibility, the primary effort is on the shoulders of the individual. And we see through human history that, put simply, we're just not up to it when you leave stuff like that up to us. We're not capable of pulling ourselves up by our moral or philosophical or existential bootstraps. A good example is if we look at the 20th century, we often tell ourselves, if you read the media, we often tell ourselves that we're on some great march to morality that's on a nice, beautiful linear progression line. In the 20th century, we killed more of each other than in the preceding 19 centuries put together. That's how we are. Alexander Solzhenitsyn said it, I think, best. He said, the line that divides good and evil cuts through the heart of every man and woman. So on some level, when your system of validation requires people to do something, to self-actualize in some way, there is going to be trouble. There is going to be a problem. So stepping back from that then, what we can see from what would work, given what we have seen from what hasn't worked, collectively speaking at least, is that if there was a way of finding validation, there would have to be at least two criteria that it would have to fulfill. The first is that it would have to transcendentally anchor human value. That notion of human intrinsic worth would have to be anchored outside the closed system. And the second is, it would have to do something about the brokenness and imperfection that's intrinsic to every human heart. It would have to not leave it all up to us. It couldn't just be all up to us to shoulder that burden of actualization or validation or whatever we want to call it ourselves. And for me, when I look at that, and then I look at the Christian message and the person of Jesus Christ, I see a perfect fit. I see a perfect fit. There's much more to say and there's much more to discuss, of course. But when I look at what the Christian message says and what the offer of a relationship with God is, I see firstly that we are endowed with intrinsic worth and value simply by virtue of the fact that we are created by God in His image. He delights in us, He knows us, in each of us, regardless of what we believe, by name. He loves us, and by virtue of that alone, we have intrinsic worth and intrinsic value, transcendentally anchored, that no one can mess with. No one inside our system, not even us. Not even us, not even we can mess with it. So that's the first point. And to the second point, and this is where Christianity, I think, distinguishes itself from any other worldview, religious or irreligious, theistic or atheistic, in human history. It's not based on things you have to do. It's given as a free gift of love, and all we are called to do is to accept that free gift of love and that gift of relationship with our Creator. So on any measure, I think, the Christian worldview stands pretty tall and is worthy of more investigation when we look at this question of validation. And so when we consider the question, which guru got it right, I don't want to rebut the question, but the answer is that they all got it wrong the minute that they claimed to be gurus. Because they were pointing to a way. And people aren't looking for a way. They're looking for a rescue. They're looking for an identity. So it had to be a person and a relationship, not a philosophy or a system. Then a philosophy and a system can flow from that. Of course it can. Of course from that ethical frameworks flow. Of course from that ways of living and ways of relating flow. That all flows naturally from that. But it begins with a relationship. And in terms of finding validation, I don't want to rebut the topic of that either. It's on a lot of flyers. But when we look at the Christian worldview, it's not actually about finding validation. All of the other worldviews are. Christianity is about stepping back, being honest, being humble, but being courageous enough to say that I actually can't find validation holistically. I need to receive validation. Because in Christianity, validation is given as a gift by God. It's not something we find. It's something we receive. It's interesting, that final scene of The Martian, it leaves you with this very high view of humankind, our capacity to innovate, to engineer, to science, to resilience our way out of any problem. But funnily enough, well, I think that was clearly the message of the movie. The reality of it is that he did some incredible things to stay alive, but he didn't fly back on his own. He was rescued. He was rescued. He just kept himself alive for long enough for them to come and rescue him. The rescue had to be transcendent, it had to come from outside the system, it had to come externally, and it didn't come in his own strength. And that, for me, sets off some interesting alarm bells, both in my mind, in my heart, and when I look across my generation, the ones that preceded it, the ones that are coming. We could all do with a wake-up call as to where and how we think about validation. And I think it's very much worth us looking to the person of Jesus Christ and considering the Christian faith as a way through which we can find or receive the validation that we've all been looking for. Thanks so much for listening.